Welcome to the OK Book Club. This is The War That Saved My Life. This is Book 3, Episode 3. And again, don't listen unless you've read the following pages. This is from pages 185 through 248, chapters 27 through 35. And I'll say this up front. Big picture. It's interesting. I usually go chapter by chapter and go over my feelings as the chapters evolve. But having read all these chapters, I'll say this up front. What's great about what's happening now is that the war is really starting to be, as we move into page 250 and beyond, and obviously at that point, we only have 70 pages, not even that, to finish the book. But the war is starting to arrive at their home. And some background, 1939 was when they had the evacuation. They knew that Germany was on the march. They knew that Germany was threatening, but the actual fighting in Britain really hadn't started. There was the German U-boats, which were submarines. Children's submarines are ships that are underwater that you can't see. And unfortunately, a lot of the attacks by the Germans were done in this way, where ships, British ships, and people were killed. And strategically for the Germans, they did this to isolate Britain, because Britain is an island away from the shores of Europe, and a lot of what Britain had in terms of resources and food, as I mentioned earlier in the last podcast, was impacted because they got a lot from other countries in Europe. So without the ships coming in, this impacted the country, and Germany figured the more England was weaker across the board, militarily by the sinking of their ships, economically by not being able to have as much money and resources and food, and then socially. There was a propaganda, as I again mentioned in the last podcast, with getting information out to people through pamphlets that hopefully would prop up the country's morale, the country feeling good about itself, the country wanting to defend itself, not to give in. So much of this was what was going around in the background of this story, between these lives of two children and someone that had to take them in, Miss Smith. And think about it, it's so hard to understand what was going on in the minds of everyone throughout Western Europe. Germany, friends, and not to give you a big history lesson here, but it's important to understand the background and what had happened before this time period that explains why Germany ended up causing this war and the rise of Hitler. Germany had lost prior, back in 1914 and 1917, Germany had lost World War I, had been defeated by a lot of the European powers. Britain, France, the United States had gotten involved, and they had become very frustrated by their defeat. And over a short number of years, obviously, less than 30 years, Germany had this, like I said, built up hostility to being punished because they lost World War II. And this allowed them to start World War II. During this time, as we head into 1940, first they ended up invading Poland. And if you look at a map, friends, Germany is on the eastern side of Europe, and then you have Poland east of Germany, and then you have. have Russia, which was the Soviet Union at that time. Britain, Germany went into Poland. That was the big flashpoint. That was when Europe got all anxious and upset. And little by little, they started marching west. They took over Norway, as the book mentioned on page 244. They took over Denmark. They took over Holland, then Belgium. At this point, Winston Churchill became England's new prime minister, which, friends, is the president of the country. And then what they were thinking is that England would be next, and as it turned out, France was next. During this time, and again, to wrap up the history, because this is not what this book is about, but around the same time as we go into 1941, Italy had their plans to kind of take over some of Europe. Japan had plans to take over a lot of Asia. So Japan, Italy joined up with Germany as you went through the early 1940s, and they became, for lack of a better word, a team, a force to be reckoned with. And it was that horrible day on December 7th, 1941, that Japan ended up bombing Pearl Harbor, which was our naval base in Hawaii. And that was what brought us into this war on the other side of the planet. So little history. On page 245, what was also interesting, as England is getting ready to enter this war with a direct fight with Germany, they gave the country 7 rules. 1, don't waste food. 2, don't talk to strangers. 3, keep all information to yourself. 4, always listen to government instructions and carry them out. 5, report anything suspicious to the police. 6, do not spread rumors. And 7, lock away anything that might help the enemy if we are invaded, which meant guns. And something also that is talked about in this story is spies. And a lot of the rumors that went around that they think led some of these countries in Europe to be brought down so quickly is that they had German spies that infiltrated the country, their countries early on, and tried to, again, change the narrative, change the idea about Germany coming in and helping them, getting information as to these countries' military, their bases, where they would be suspect in terms of being able to be taken advantage of. Unfortunately, this was a fact of war during this time. So getting back to our story, heading into chapters 27, the big picture is that not a lot is happening, but what is happening that allows you to turn the pages that I've said throughout these podcasts on this particular book is the micro relationships, which means the small little pieces of the relationship between Jamie, Ada, and Miss Smith. Primarily what we're dealing with is Ada and Miss Smith, and why Ada is still so angry and upset with Miss Smith, and how Miss Smith is trying to make life better for Ada. So as we get into chapter 27, and again, I know I'm a broken record here, but just as it's getting boring, just as something is, I'm just starting to skip ahead, something really interesting happens. And more often than not, it's not actually action and adventure like there's some kind of threat going on outside. It's the internal action and adventure that's going on. And we learn in chapter 27, we learn about Miss Smith and her past and her father, and ultimately why he came to resent or be angry at Miss Smith in her younger years, that he wanted her to be married. He was happy and proud that she got into Oxford, just amazing college in Britain, but he thought all women should get married, and Miss Smith didn't do that, right? And she kept talking about, well, it's complicated. And her mother kind of just went along with everything that her father had said. So there was a lot of regret in her childhood. So Ada is brought back to the doctor. There's talk about surgery. Then we talk about learning how to sew. And again, I made a note that it's getting boring. And then they talk about creating an Anderson shelter, which is something I hadn't heard about before. I needed to get educated about this. This was little tin huts that basically were dug in the ground, so if you knew that a bomb was coming in your area, you could go down. It's kind of like a bomb shelter. And she mentions that ours didn't look safe. It was small, dark, and flimsy. And basically, you went down 3 steps and you opened up a little door, and inside was just room for 2 long benches facing each other. Jamie wanted to bring his cat, and Miss Smith even accommodates that and made sure that they had nearby a little basket they could bring Jamie's cat into the Anderson shelter. In chapter 28, again, I made note, I'm getting bored, and all of a sudden the author pivots and I get really upset. I actually wrote down, she talks about Miss Smith and her health. She had to make an effort to literally get out of bed. She was always tired, and what's popping into my head, and I was like, no, I don't like this when this happens. I don't think it's appropriate for kids' books, but too often people are dying that are important to the main character. Dogs dying. I mean, it's so ridiculous. So I'm hoping and I'm praying that Miss Smith, nothing happens to her, but all of a sudden that's entering the reader's mind. And as we keep going into chapter 28, it's Christmas time, and a lot happens with Christmas. There's an explanation for Ada and Jamie what Christmas is all about. Miss Smith makes a beautiful dress for Ada, and she tells her that you look beautiful. And as you go into chapter 29, Ada's having a discussion with her friend Maggie, and in the middle of page 201, which is again so insightful, Maggie basically says, hey, why didn't you write back to me? And you know what? If you needed help writing, you could have had Miss Smith help you. And then Ada says, I didn't want to ask her. I don't like her helping me. Why ever not? Ada says, I don't want to get used to her. She's just someone to stay with for a little while. She's not, actually real. So again, friends, stop, think. We've had enough of this to understand that Ada is angry and upset with Miss Smith, in my opinion, because she wants her mother to be a real mother. And anytime that is good, that's given to Ada, even though she's a smart girl and you should think that she should have the wherewithal at her age to be able to think about her thinking and be grateful, be nice to this person that's given her nothing but love and affection and everything that her own mother didn't give her. She continually goes back to the fact that Miss Smith didn't want her. She said it out loud. But Miss Smith has to counsel her about the fact that, yes, you know what? That didn't mean I didn't want you. I didn't want children, she said. And she tried to relay to Ada what the difference is with that. Older lady, single lady, never took care of children. And as much as Miss Smith tried to get through to Ada about this, Ada is still pushing back because, again, even though her past life was horrible, she wanted her real mother to love her. And as much as it didn't make sense, this is some of the gymnastics that she's going through in her head. And again, friends, some of this doesn't make sense, but when you're in a bad place in your mind, when you've had trauma in your past, this is what's happening with Ada. I mean, here is someone that doesn't know how to be happy. And page 206, I'm sorry, I'm celebrating. Those of you that don't know, that's our class, 206. OMG. Something that I wrote down that you have to ponder. Again, going back to everything we've discussed with Ada and how she's trying to manage her thoughts, emotions, and feelings. This is what she says at the bottom of 206. I didn't know what to say, right? Somehow Christmas was making me feel jumpy inside. All this talk about being together and being happy and celebrating, it felt threatening, like I shouldn't be part of it, like I wasn't allowed. And Susan wanted me to be happy, which was scarier still. In other words, she doesn't know what happiness means. She doesn't know what everyone in life deserves. So her breakdown at Christmas with her dress is all through chapter 30, and on page 213, it's just heartbreaking what you hear. She, again, has a panic attack when Miss Smith basically told her that she looked beautiful. And as we get into chapter 31, after this long built up horrible morning at Christmas, they didn't go to church, but nevertheless Susan was still loving and didn't say anything back to Ada in terms of being angry. And it's clear, you have to infer that Susan understands that Ada in her past life with her mother was traumatized. Ada, and that morning when she woke up, I guess it was Christmas Eve when all this happened, she literally was wrapped up so she wouldn't be flailing and screaming and yelling and running around the house. And Jamie looked at Ada as she woke up. He opened his eyes and smiled his beautiful smile. All my life I would remember the sweetness of that smile. Good morning, Ada, Jamie said. Merry Christmas. And Miss Smith then saw Ada as she woke up. She saw me and she smiled too. Smiled. Good morning, Ada, she said. Merry Christmas. On page 219, she's struggling in her head, and as she's getting gifts, and she almost feels like apologizing and being grateful and thanking Miss Smith. She's going about her day as it's a normal day, but then she says on this page, what's wrong with me? So it's almost as if as a reader, you're finally saying to yourself, come on, Ada, yes, thank you. Thank you for acknowledging and moving on with your feelings and trying to take charge of them and moving away from your past. And there's little evidence of this. As much as she has a hard time verbalizing her love and her being grateful, she makes a Christmas gift out of wool. She makes a scarf for Miss Smith. So there is goodness in her. We know this, and little by little it's coming out. And as we're into chapter 33, she moves from being angry to fragile. Listen to this. Basically, Ada ends up learning that Miss Smith had said that the doctor had mentioned to her that if the treatment for her foot had started early, she could have had a normal foot. Most babies born with club feet have them fixed right away. All the way fixed? Susan put her hand on my shoulder. Yes, all the way. Ada's saying to herself, I could have always lived outside the one room. I could have been like Jamie, running fast. I said, I thought you kept writing to Mam because you wanted to get rid of us. Susan said, no wonder you were angry. I felt fragile, not the way I had when I exploded on Christmas Eve, but the way I'd felt the next morning, when the only thing that kept me together was Jamie's smile, Jamie and Susan's smile. And again, because she doesn't think this and she doesn't say it out loud, it's clear, or at least I'm hoping, what I'm thinking here is that this idea about hopefully her moving away from rationalize her mother being a good mother, that she didn't fix her foot, right? And but again, if you go and ponder this, friends, because she was poor, maybe she wasn't able to fix the foot. Back then, this is not necessarily something you can do in a hospital. Hospitals cost a lot of money. If you're poor, you can have things fixed, even if you wanted to. But what we're talking about in this chapter is the idea that they can surgically fix Ada's foot, but Miss Smith can't do it without the permission of Ada's mother, and we learn that she got a letter returned that Ada's mother had moved, and that's why maybe she hasn't been responding. They didn't know how to find her. And basically at this point, Ada sits down because she's now started to learn to read and write, and she says at the end of chapter 33 on page 232, I didn't feel angry. I felt sad. So sad I could get lost in the sadness. But when I finished my tea, I got out paper and pencil, and in my very best handwriting, wrote a letter. Dear ma'am, it said, please let them fix me. So now as we head into the end of chapter 35 and the end of this podcast, we learn all the details about what's going on outside and with the war with Germany. At the bottom of page 248, in the middle of May, Hitler invaded France. The British Army had over 370,000 soldiers stationed there. They fought and the French fought, but the Germans pushed them back and back. Then came June and the miracle of Dunkirk. Yes, they called it a miracle, but in our village, it felt like a disaster. Friends, again, little history lesson. What ended up happening was, as bad as it was with Germany coming in and taking over France, at least they were able to evacuate. And that's what happened at this port of Dunkirk. They were able to evacuate all the British soldiers and a lot of the French artillery and weapons and everything that went into the war effort across the English Channel into Britain. But apparently, as we're going to learn, this is impacting our friends, Ada, Miss Smith, and Jamie. And this is when a historical fiction novel really gets to be good, because we're mixing the characters who are fiction with real events and background in terms of what's happened during this war, which is nonfiction. That's why they call it historical fiction. That's been the podcast for this installment, book 3, episode 3, The War That Saved My Life, KEVMOK21@gmail.com. For comments, questions, you know the drill. Happy reading, my friends.